Welcome to Generous Futures. Good afternoon. My name is Farah Khan. I lead the Consent Comes First office at our university. And I am so excited. I know so many people in the Alumni Association are so excited about this panel today, and we can't wait to dive into the conversation. Before we begin, I want us to make sure that we acknowledge that where we are and the land that we're on. And Toronto is the dish with one spoon territory. And the dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. One of the things that I think about with this as someone who works in gender-based violence and sexual violence is making sure that that connection is clear to me in my work. And I love this quote by Dr. Sarah Hunt that really grounds me in this understanding. And she says, so as we have conversations on campus about sexual violence, we must remember that Indigenous people enter into the space, students, staff, faculty, with an existing relationship to rape culture. Sexual violence is just one manifestation of the continuum of violence wrought by settler colonialism. Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, trans, and queer people have been resisting colonial rape culture for years, mourning our loved ones whose lives have been taken in a country in which their deaths are treated as unexceptional. And that's from Dr. Sarah Hunt. She teaches at Victoria University. And I just think for me, making sure that we're always centering the voices and needs and communities of Indigenous people when we're talking about consent, when we're talking about gender-based violence, and recognizing that the only way to end it is to honor the truth and move forward on the recommendations within the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. And I urge you to read it if you haven't read that report. I'm delighted today to be moderating the first panel in a series of 3 of Generous Futures series. I'd like to acknowledge our conversation might bring up a lot of different feelings for survivors of gender-based violence or any of us that are dealing with this issue. We're in a moment right now where a lot of conversations are happening around gender-based violence, and we can never forget that there are survivors in the room, including ourselves. So we're going to drop a link in the chat about supports from Consent Comes First. We also have a virtual self-care room that we're going to send you after this conversation to do some self-care for yourself and just take a breath in a moment. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our lead sponsor of this series, TD Bank Group, for helping advance these important conversations. TD Bank Group has been a great supporter of our university, and we're delighted that they joined us on this journey of understanding. Today, we're focusing on the struggles and triumphs of leaders face in addressing gender-based violence. We're going to tackle questions like how to address gender inequality. What does just injustice feel like and look like? What is abuse of power and harmful norms that perpetuate gender-based violence? And how do we address them? And what is the role of nonprofits, governments, community leaders can play in addressing this issue? And lastly, how are we funding these issues and are not funding them? And how can we do that better? I'm going to pose a bunch of questions to the panel, and I want to thank people for sending in questions as well, because we're going to get to them. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to these amazing leaders. First, I'm going to introduce Paulette Sr., who's the president and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. If you don't have a major crush on Paulette for the astounding amount of work that she's done, I don't know who you are. She's really devoted her career to empowering women and girls to overcome barriers and reach their full potential. Through her work and advocacy with shelters, as well as employment, housing programs, she's earned numerous awards and become one of the most respected women leaders, I would just say leaders, in Canada. She joined the foundation, the Canadian Women's Foundation, in 2016 after 10 years as the CEO of YWCA Canada. Her work with the foundation is guided by the vision of inclusive national movement towards gender equity that will strengthen all of Canada. We are so lucky to welcome Paulette to this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Paulette. Next, I'm going to invite Jessica Catru-Green. And Jessica is someone that I've had the honor to work with at Ryerson, and now seeing her fully bloom and blossom as this, I'm going to say a word, badass intersectional equity consultant who works with organizations to address systemic injustices facing women and Black women and racialized women. Over the past 2 years, she's worked with businesses, not-for-profit organizations that want to deepen their understanding of anti-oppression and turn their leading into action. In addition to this work, she's worked in nonprofit sector, conducting research and public policy analysis on a mission to advance feminist policy and practice in Canada. Again, if you don't have an amazing love of Jessica, just wait till the end of this panel, you're going to. And lastly, we have Joanne Ryan, who's the Vice President of Philanthropy at TD Wealth. She develops strategies to help clients incorporate philanthropy in their overall financial and estate plans. She also led TD's research efforts around women and philanthropy since 2014. She's done incredible work to make sure that women get funding. And she's the architect and executive director of Private Giving Foundation, the first donor advised fund to be launched by a financial institution in Canada. She serves on several boards and is active volunteer on several gift planning committees for charities. We're so lucky that you're here. Thank you so much, Joanne. I am already excited about this panel, so I hope everybody else is. We're going to get into some really great questions right now. So one of the first things that I would like us to think for all of us, and maybe we can start, is really think about the fact is, why is this topic of gender-based violence important to talk about right now? And maybe Paulette, you can start us off.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be a part of this panel, delighted to be among these wonderful panelists, as well as, to be contributing to this important conversation. And thank you to Ryson, Krishan and his team for bringing this forward. So even before the pandemic, we knew that levels of gender-based violence in Canada were at an unacceptable rate. And we talked about that all the time. It was part of our ongoing conversation within the sector. On average, once every day, we've heard that and seen the stats that every 6 days a woman is killed by her intimate partner. And when you take a moment to think about that, to me, that is a staggering reality, right? That every 6 days in this country, a woman is killed by her intimate partner. And we know that women facing multiple forms of discrimination, including Indigenous women, women living with disabilities, that they're facing a disproportionately higher risk. And that was certainly something that we saw during the pandemic with all of the lockdowns, social distancing and quarantining. Risk escalated for those living in abusive situations even more. And they faced even higher barriers to reaching out to help, to access the supports that they need. So we know, for example, that one of the horrible realities that we faced during the pandemic is that femicide was at, and still is at, an alarming rate and rose in Canada. In fact, it spiked. So there's been a 26% increase in killings of women and girls since 2019. That's just over the past 3 years, maybe even less than 3 years. So yes, ending all gender-based violence is more urgent now than ever, whether it's intimate partner violence, sexual assault or harassment, stalking, or cyber violence. That's why this topic should be top of mind right across this country.
Thank you so much. And it is alarming, those stats. I know in Ontario alone, I think it was an 84% increase of femicides just last year. So, we're ringing the bell, ringing the alarm. Jessica, for you, why is this issue so important right now?
I think that for me, the numbers have always been really scary, really frightening to hear. We know, during the pandemic, there was a 30% increase globally, and then Canada unfortunately fell into that same those same numbers. We like to think, oh, we're so progressive here in Canada and things are great and everybody's safe. But for me, this conversation needs to happen now. And it's so important to discuss these things now, is because femicide is one of the most preventable forms of death. And yet, for years, we've been having this conversation and we're still seeing 30% increase, 84% increase. And quite frankly, it's upsetting. It's upsetting to know that we have the tools, we have the resources, we have the means to prevent people from dying. And yet we haven't stopped it. We haven't gotten to a place where we can say this is no longer an issue, or we've eliminated a gender-based violence or femicide in Canada. And so for me, we need to have these conversations now because we are so much further from where we were 3 years ago. from where we are now, and we have all the things, we know what we need to do. It's just a matter of implementation, and that's where we see ourselves falling short, and that's a sad reality that I wish just didn't exist.
I totally agree, Jessica. It's one of those things where you're like, if this is preventable and predictable, why isn't there movement on it? Joanne, for you, where do you see this as being such an important issue, and why now do we need to talk about it?
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor, and it's a privilege for TD to be sponsoring this series also. So I'm going to come at it from a little bit of a different lens, more of a philanthropy lens, and how that can be helpful to deal with gender-based violence. So the pandemic's been very challenging for everybody. There's no question about that, and it's extremely tough on women. And as we've heard, many have had to leave the workforce to take care of young children and aging parents. As we've adapted to a virtual world, online bullying and stalking women virtually became more rampant. However, if you look at some of the silver linings with the pandemic, and we look at inequalities, whether it's race, Indigenous rights, gender equality, a lot of these have come to the surface. And as said before, these are nothing new, but they were now front page news. And while many suffered financially during the pandemic, the wealthy did not, and the super wealthy who I deal with did not. In fact, many wealthy people got richer during the pandemic. Stock markets soared, and many of the super wealthy who would normally be jet setting all over the world were suddenly stuck at home because they couldn't fly, they couldn't jet set, either stuck at home or in their cottages, which were probably more like mansions on a lake. And even if they hadn't been philanthropic in the past, all of a sudden they're reading about inequalities. Their net worth is increasing. That's number two. And number three, because I talked to a lot of them because they were very bored, and prior to the pandemic, very difficult to nail down or even to talk to or have a meeting with them. They actually started to reflect on their personal situation. And for many, again, who not intentionally in the past were not philanthropic, but they actually started to reflect on the good situation that they were in financially. They started to become aware of a lot of inequalities, and started to actually think about doing something about it with regard to their own personal philanthropy. And just to give you an example, the Private Giving Foundation, the donor advised fund that I run, we actually had a donor reach out who has never in his history of giving, and I'm saying his history of given to anything related to gender-based equality. Like a typical male, he was funding education, maybe some research into healthcare, and that was it. And he actually reached out to me and said he's been reading a lot about gender and some of the issues that have surfaced during the pandemic. And he's quite wealthy, and he said, I'd like to direct 500,000. One went to the YWCA Toronto, and the other 500,000, so we're talking $1 million here, went to the Redwood, a safe haven for women and children fleeing abuse. And so I have to be positive that some people are waking up to the issues. They're in the very fortunate position of having the money and the wealth to do something about it. So I think the time is right for organizations that are doing this work in gender-based violence, as well as the media, to get the word out about the work that you're doing, and you'll see hopefully more donations that will follow. And then, my final comment, and I have been involved with Canadian Women's Foundation for many years as a donor, as a volunteer. And one of the things that I learned very early on from the Canadian Women's Foundation is when you help a woman, there is a ripple effect, because they will then go on to help their family, and then they will help the community. So investing in women is always a great investment.
Thank you so much, Joanne. It's so interesting to hear such different perspectives around why we need to do this work, what's important, and also what needs to be funded around it, and how do you get attention around. One of the things I really want to understand too is the foundational work that you're doing at the Canadian Women's Foundation, Paulette. You've led an incredible career. You've worked so tirelessly to lift systemic barriers and champion equity for women and girls. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Canadian Women's Foundation and what you're doing there, specifically around gender-based violence, and why is it important to Canada? And one thing I will say is Signal to Help is I think, blowing everybody away about the work with that, but there's so much more than the Canadian Women's Foundation does.
Thank you. Thanks for mentioning that, and I'll touch on that later as well. And Joanne, I really appreciated your last answer because it's important to have doses of positivity despite the grueling work that gender-based violence gets us into, and that we have to get this work done. But we can't do it, at least my organization can't do it without the support, the philanthropic support that's so necessary from folks of all stripes and of all levels of income. So let me just take a moment to answer this question in three ways, ways that we're working specifically around gender-based violence. So first, ever since we started just over 30 years ago, we funded many programs. In fact, I believe over 2,500 programs throughout the country that serve women and children who've experienced violence. And this includes shelters, second stage housing, counseling, legal support services, sexual assault services, loan funds or revolving loan funds that help women rebuild their lives after leaving situations of abuse. So a gamut of services. And we know that violence prevention among young people is also critical. So we fund teen healthy relationship programs. It's one of my favorite, that help youth of all genders recognize signs of abuse and practice healthy relationship skills. And we know that that's important because once you're working on prevention, as Jessica mentioned before, these things are preventable, right? So if we invest more in prevention, particularly towards young people, within these programs actually learn what a healthy relationship is and isn't. And not just intimate romantic relationships, but all relationships. So that's the first area, because then with that kind of work, they actually learn how to set boundaries for themselves in relationships, right? The second area I'll speak specifically about is about our work on this issue during the pandemic. Well before the pandemic, we knew that GBV services were chronically underfunded, and these services struggled to meet community needs. You know, we didn't have people lining up to give us money. We had to pound the pavement on this. So when this health crisis hit, they faced higher costs to accommodate new COVID safety protocols and upgrade technology to provide services virtually. And I don't think anyone ever thought before the pandemic how to shift GBV services to virtual settings. That's not something we ever thought about, right? So, but we had to get it done. So for the last 2 years, we've been calling on our donors and the government for urgent emergency funding to support these critical services who had to more than pivot and repivot in order to do their work. And we've worked with the government, for example, over the pandemic, where we've distributed over $90 million in emergency GBV funding towards GBV services. And going forward, we also have to make sure that there is strong core funding for these services so that we don't find ourselves in this situation ever again. We're working on a project designed to what we call shock-proof the GBV sector from future crises. And then lastly, I'll talk about our Signal for Help that you talked about. We actually have a Signal for Help responder campaign happening right now, which is all about engaging the public in helping to end gender-based violence. We've heard of the Signal for Help, which is this hand signal, but we've expanded it to a campaign to help folks know how to respond. So during the pandemic, we started promoting the hand signal to be used in the context of a video setting just like this. We thought that was the confines of it. Of course, it turned out not to be, because TikTok and other social media tools took it to where they needed it to be. So it's really about having someone check in on you safely. But the Signal for Help has since gone viral, as we know, and it's been adopted by organizations around the world. Signal is only, but it's only as good as folks know how to respond, right? So there are limitations. So we are asking people to become responders and learn how best to respond when friends and family and coworkers need the support and call on you because of abuse or whatever they're going through, whether they show the signal for help or in other things that they do, other ways, right? We know that, for example, in the US, the signal for help was not necessarily recognizing though she was using it, but she was mouthing the word help. So there are other ways as well. There's a lot of shame and stigma around the issue of gender-based violence, and the Signal for Help Responder campaign aims to change the culture and provide tools to have critical conversations and for folks to learn more and get involved in terms of what needs to be done. So we've created a site called signalresponder.ca that folks can check out to learn more. So those are the 3 areas.
Just casually doing so much in a small, mighty team. It's amazing the work that Canadian Women's Foundation has done. And I love that you talk about shock-proofing the violence against women movement and making sure that we know that. I also, for folks in the chat, I added in the Signal to Help website, and I also added in more information about one of the articles that came out about one of the young women that used that to get away from a hard situation. I want to take us now to, what a little bit of what Paula was speaking about, so many women were impacted by the pandemic, so many communities, but we know that communities that were really impacted even deeper and hard was, of course, communities, racialized Black, Indigenous communities that were facing so many intersections of equity. And so, Jessica, could you talk a little bit why it's important to talk about intersectionality and equity when we talk about gender-based violence?
Yeah, happy to. And I have to say, Paulette, to some of the things you were saying, I think the reason why intersectionality is so important, or the way in which I see you can approach intersectionality, is by removing the chronic underfunding of the feminist sector. We have had, it's not unique to the Canadian Women's Foundation or to YWCA Canada. The entire sector globally is chronically underfunded and can't keep staff, can't retain staff to do the simple things that an organization needs to then do the prevention work that you're talking about, to then doing the campaigns and the education. And so really it starts with people like who Joanne works with, whether it be donors, philanthropists, and then our policymakers, to really get at the one thing that's really impacting all of this is that there hasn't been a focus. There isn't any money thrown in the direction just to have people to be able to do the work. And when you do have people to be able to do the work, the way that we've been able to see progress, I think, in feminist policy, feminist research, and feminist work across Canada has really bloomed over the last 5 years. Partially, I want to say, because there's been more women who are involved, more men who are engaged, more people who are just generally aware of things. But we know that that's not enough. Being just generally aware of things isn't enough, unfortunately, because GBV is such a vast problem that it impacts different people differently. And that's pretty much how I like to define intersectionality is things impact people differently depending on what their background is, what their experiences are, who they are as a person, what their social location is. And so that's the first thing. And so if we only look at GBV from one perspective, and unfortunately that perspective for so long has been grounded in the experiences of one type of women, white women, and what they experience, how they experience GBV, what they experience, what that experience looks like. What we end up seeing is that we actually end up missing critical risk factors for other women of color, Black women, and Indigenous women, because we haven't understood how to identify GBV from a different perspective. I'll give you one quick example. What I like to think about all the time is that, or when I explain this concept, is that we in the GBV sector, there's a lot of focus on conducting these risk assessments to be able to determine how much risk a woman is at, or how much risk a woman is at of being murdered by her intimate partner. And for a lot of those risks, you can actually dissect them to say, well, this actually probably wouldn't be as fitting for a Black woman. One of the risks across many of the risk assessments, I'll say, is previous interactions with police officers. Now, within the Black community particularly, calling the police isn't the first idea that pops into someone's head when they want to reach safety. Calling the police isn't safe for the Black community. And so when you have a risk factor that's looking at call the police, or how many times have police been involved in a case, if you're talking to a Black woman, that actually doesn't resonate with her because she's unlikely to have called the police in the first place. She's likely to have called a friend. She's likely to have called other family members. Sometimes we know Muslim women in particular often call their imams and people who they trust, or religious leaders in their communities, other women, really people in their community. And so when we talk about GBV and having an intersectional lens, I always think back to those two examples, because if you're filling out a risk assessment and you're thinking, oh, well, this particular woman hasn't called the police, therefore her risk isn't as great as somebody who has. What you're actually saying is, what you're actually doing is missing out on the fact that she hasn't called the police is even it could be even a greater risk to her safety. So when we need to be able to look at the intersectional or the intersectionality of the way that people experience gender-based violence, or else they're going to unfortunately fall through the cracks. We're going to see more and more cases in which people are being murdered. Here and think, well, how did this happen? How did we get to this place? But really the signs are right in front of us. And if we're not going to put our foot forward and think about how gender-based violence impacts other people, we won't be able to address gender-based violence from a lens that protects all types of women, whether it be women with disabilities who experience GBV in a completely different way, or Indigenous women who also experience GBV as a result of state violence. Will be stuck in our same loop, in our same circle of wondering why and how we weren't able to prevent somebody's very preventable death.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And it's always such a good point that you're raising around that it's not a cookie cutter. We can't just kind of say, okay, this is how we deal with violence against women. This is what it looks like. We always have to look at, okay, what are all the factors that make up this person's life? Who is this person? Are they connected to community? Are they refugee? Are they an immigrant? Are they from the Black community? What community within that? Like, there's so many things. So thank you for raising that, because it's a critical reminder that sometimes people say, well, violence against women happens to everybody. It does, but how people access services, how people can be safe, how people are believed is also based on our social location. And I really believe that's such a critical point to raise. Joanne, I want to bring you in here too. And, you've done such amazing research efforts around women in philanthropy, as well as private giving foundation, which provides individuals the opportunity to build legacy of helping others. So the issues that, Paulette and Jessica are raising, really, these are the kind of issues that you probably raise with people that you're working with. Can you tell us more about how philanthropy can address gender-based violence?
Sure. So I thought I would just give a little bit of a background on why TD actually did this research on women and philanthropy. It started a number of years ago, where TD actually engaged Boston Consulting to look at our investment advisors and how they were dealing with women. And we know that we knew we had a problem because life expectancy of women is greater than men. And once the man died, within a year, the investments of the women would leave the company. And why did that happen? It's because our advisors were not doing a good job at all in cultivating relationships with women. And women, we learned, very early on how they make investment decisions very differently than men. They crave a different type of a relationship, and we had a lot of work to do in order to train our investment advisors in terms of how to cultivate women, just if we wanted to maintain business for them. And so in 2014, we figured, well, we know women make investment decisions very differently than men. And so we suspected that they also made philanthropic decisions differently than men. And we started to study that. We did quantitative research. We also held focus groups with women philanthropists in major cities across the country. And of course, women do make those decisions. But why is this so important? Well, if you look at 2020, the end of 2020, women's wealth in Canada is 2.1 trillion, and by 2030, that's expected to be 4.3 trillion. And so, part of that, okay, is women often inherit twice because their life expectancy is greater than men from a parent and then again from a spouse or a partner. We still have some work to narrow the wage gap, but women are slowly making their way up in managerial positions also. And so we're basically predicting that 600,000 women will have the ability to make a major gift to charity, which we're defining as $10,000 or more. And so charities actually need to change their approach in terms of how they deal with women if they're going to attract some of this wealth. They need to stop looking at men as the donors and women as the volunteers, even though women are terrific volunteers, but they're often the main decision maker when it comes to donors. In fact, research says women, particularly millennials, are primary decision makers when it comes to legacy planning and charitable giving. And they've even said, millennials have said that the pandemic has made charitable giving even more important in their life. For women, relationships with the organization that they support are extremely important. They want to get to know the staff, they want to get to know the volunteers, they want to get to know the board. In fact, women will often want to volunteer, roll up their sleeves, get involved before even considering making a major gift. And so the other thing that we really encourage our clients to do is to do a philanthropic plan that reflects their values and to go through that exercise, because there are 86,000 registered charities in Canada. We know they're all knocking on everybody's door, calling during dinner and asking for money. And what we don't like to see with our high net worth clients is that they just react. And they give here and they give a bit there and they give here, and they're just reacting to these organizations that are approaching them. And if they take the time to put a philanthropic plan together that reflects their values, then once they're going to have a greater impact with the organizations and the causes that are important to them. B, families that do that actually say it then becomes easier to say no, not that it isn't a great cause, but it's not what you've decided is really, really important to you. So I think as more donors become more strategic with their giving and take the time to do that philanthropic plan and identify values such as gender-based violence, that we're going to see organizations that are doing work in that area really benefit from their support.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I love this window of understanding what the issue is, but then how do we get support that's not just from government, that's looking at lots of ways the community can take part in this. And I think that brings us to kind of a question I want to ask Paulette. Paulette, besides financial resources, how can donors, community members, advocates get involved and support this issue? And do you have examples that people are doing already with the Canadian Women's Foundation?
Thank you for that question, because we've really been working hard to engage the broader public, where donors and community and everyone that works in the sector can actually be in a space together, whether it's to co-learn, co-engage, but just really to be able to advance the issue and learn as well. So I'm going to go back to the example I gave earlier of the Signal for Help as an example of a campaign that's been effective in engaging people around gender-based violence, since it's actually a tool that people have been able to easily share through their social media channels, and we wanted something like that, something that can spread like wildfire, but also engage on the critical topic of gender-based violence. And so it's been able to spark new conversations and, in fact, new awareness about the issue of gender-based violence in Canada and around the world. And based on public Sorry, I muted myself by mistake. Based on public interest in the Signal and the increased risk of gender-based violence during the pandemic, we were able to secure government funding, as I mentioned earlier, to develop the Signal for Help responder campaign. So we developed the Signal for Help, and then we thought, okay, so how can we deepen this learning opportunity while we have people's attention? Because in this world of social media, getting people's attention is not an easy thing. So how can we deepen people's knowledge and understanding to actually help on an issue that we've been struggling to move forward for years, right? So through this funding and the campaign, we are then able to take a step further and really focus on educating everyone about how to respond and support. So when people sign up to become a responder, they download an action guide. They're invited to participate in a learning journey so that they can connect and learn from experts and other responders like the folks on this call. So far, we've been able to build a community of about 20,000 people who have signed up. Isn't that incredible? I mean, if you've been in this work for a long time, that's an impressive number, right? So just people signing up to say, I want to learn more. And so we're going to keep building it so that we can change the current climate to one from one of stigma to one that supports survivors. So you asked about the challenges when it comes to engaging donors, volunteers, community leaders, and advocacy and support. And I think that when it comes to complex social issues, people will doubt that they can make a difference or don't know how to take the action. So we're making that possible through this campaign. Our recent national poll, for example, found that almost half of the people we surveyed feel that gender-based violence is too big for them to play a role in ending it. The reality, though, is that those facing abuse often disclose to people they know and trust rather than to the authorities, as Jessica pointed out. So our confidence and competence to support survivors can have a serious impact. So what we need is action at all levels: societal action, community, and individual. Advocacy and support can look as simple as a conversation on social media or between family and friends at a dinner table or coworkers, right? So if each of us knows how to recognize abuse and respond in a judgment-free way, and I want to emphasize judgment-free way, we can affect earlier and better, right? So we can actually bring the change that we seek, and our individual actions can add up to actually make a real difference for people that we're connected with.
I can't get over the 20,000. Gets me emotional. Just the
Right?
idea, it gives you hope, right? I mean, what we want is to have hope in this movement, which I think we're all kind of giving that, and it kind of brings me to also what's happening on campuses, because there was a huge conversation that happened at Western University and many campuses across this country, including our own at Ryerson, about sexual violence. And Jessica, you've been a leader on that. I don't know if people know, but Jessica was hired last year and led the sexual violence task force review of our policy and our work on campus last year, which was the first time we had an alumni student bring that work. What needs to change, or what's giving you hope about the work around gender-based violence on campus?
Yeah, Ryerson grad here of 2018. And even when I was on campus, I have to say the thing that I really appreciated about Ryerson was how forward thinking and progressive, not only the work at Consent Comes First, what was happening within that office, but the entire university. A lot of people were ready, they were engaged to have this conversation, and they were willing to put the resources, whether it be time, money, or energy, behind doing this work and eradicating GBV on campus. As a student, when I was there, I was so appreciative of it. Now coming back in reflection and in doing that work, I've seen that's only grown, and the reach across campus has grown too. And so I have to say Ryerson, as compared to some other campuses that I've worked with, is, far, far, far ahead. But what I also will say is, of course, we haven't eradicated GBV on campus. There will always be those roadblocks until things are dealt with at a systemic level. And for me, that's always, being the policy nerd or lover that I am, that's always the first step in eradicating these big societal problems. And while Ryerson has a really strong policy, what I think, and the writing is really good, what I think what we're seeing on campus is that there needs to be a little bit more practice around engaging people who don't normally have these conversations. I think the thing that I see is that those who are willing to engage, whether it be the amazing 20,000 people that the Canadian Women's Foundation has engaged, or I'm sure that maybe even double that at the Consent Comes First office, the people who are having these conversations are ready, and they're ready to go, they're engaged, they're ready to learn. But what I've seen where policy like this falls short is where people who aren't ready to have those conversations, they don't want to engage. They don't want to be engaged because they think that it's not an issue for them, where GBV actually impacts everybody. They think that it's too overwhelming, or they get scared, or unfortunately people have experienced these types of traumas in the past, and so they want to retreat from engaging in these conversations, which of course is understandable. But what we need to see more, what I continue to want to see across other campuses that I think Ryerson's doing really well is broadening the scope and the engagement to sort of non-traditional players, if you will, men and boys, people who don't have conversations on the regular about GBV, who aren't educated, who, because they feel like that conversation's not for them, they don't know how to intervene. A lot of people hear things, you'll hear often men talk about, my friend was talking about something that he did, or you would hear, oh, I kind of did this, and I wasn't sure if it was violent or if she gave me consent. And reaching out to those populations again who don't have access to those conversations, or also don't feel like they have space to have those conversations as well. Like Paulette said, I think it starts at the individual in terms of having conversations. It also starts with a community creating space, and then it goes up to our systemic pieces around changing our policy and practices. And the thing that I really love and appreciate about Ryerson's policy is our preamble. And a lot of people think, well, you have all these fancy words and such in a policy. And I say, actually, none of that means nothing except for the preamble, because that's what the preamble is speaking to, is eradicating gender-based violence, eradicating rape culture, eradicating a space in which we can allow these things to start in small, very unseeming, precarious ways, and then evolve into more egregious acts of more egregious acts of violence. And so starting with our meaning, our purpose there, and then building out our action and practice around that is so important. We've seen Ryerson do it. We need to see it at other campuses. We need to engage other non-traditional people to not only in education, but to have these conversations. And we're at that point, that's when we're really getting at our individual, our societal, and then our systemic approaches to ending GBV on campus.
And then burn down the patriarchy. Take everything down. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't. That was like my secondary agenda. I didn't. It's in there, but I may have just glossed over it.
I felt it. I've definitely felt it. I was here for it. Joanne, I want to, we're going to go to the last question for you, and then we're going to take one or two questions from the audience. Many people argue that gender-based violence is underfunded, and I don't think you need to argue about it. We know that it's underfunded. And there's significant gaps in how issues are received financial support. What are your thoughts on this, and how we can ensure that GBV is bolstered in the funding?
So actually, if I can just share my university, where I'm an alma mater, which is Bishop's University, I think they took a bold step. And everyone here is probably familiar with Giving Tuesday and what happens on Giving Tuesday. And prior to Giving Tuesday at Bishop's, there were some really serious complaints that women did not feel safe on campus, and the university took it really seriously. And when we come out with a Giving Tuesday campaign, there's a theme that goes with it. I mean, obviously alumni can support anything they want. A year ago it was mental health, when we realized that some students suffered from food insecurity and other issues on campus. This theme for our university's Giving Tuesday last December was about violence against women, and what investing in programs so that women could feel safe on campus. And as a board member of their foundation, I could not have been prouder to see them take that step forward. And this is alumni from all ages, all years, that are getting this message saying it's Giving Tuesday, and here's the major issue at the university that we'd like you to direct your dollars to. So that's just something there. But I think I think there's just great opportunity to get the word out. I've been talking about really high net worth individuals, but people can make a difference with much smaller amounts of money. I could go on and on with some examples, but YWCA, the December 6th Fund, is a fantastic fund. And one of the issues that stop women from leaving their abusive home is they don't have first and last month's rent to get out of their house with their children. And that, supporting the December 6th Fund gives that woman first and last month's rent so they can get into an apartment, get their family, their children away from the abuser, and get their life back together. And the wonderful thing about that program is that the majority of the women who receive money from it and benefit from it pay the loan back. They don't have to, but they choose to pay the loan back. So when you make a gift to help someone with first and last month's rent, it's a gift that keeps on giving when you're supporting something like the YWCA. I could go on. Shelter Movers, one of my favorite small grassroots organizations, that how does a woman leave a home? And well, they have a team of volunteers and staff that come in when it's safe and actually get their belongings, pack them up really quickly, get them to a shelter, and get them out of violence. The last thing I'd like to say is don't overlook millennials in terms of spreading the word. Maybe maybe they don't have a ton of money, but they also have they're very interested in supporting causes. If you look at Canada Helps, they actually have cause funds, so you can actually support a fund to stop gender violence at Canada Helps that will then support a myriad of all kinds of different organizations doing that work. And don't overlook millennials or the younger people to help volunteer, because they know how to spread the word on social media, and a lot of donations will really add up. So millennials can be your secret to getting more funds into these organizations.
Yeah, and I would say even Zennials, which I love that there's a whole TikTok generation that is talking about this conversation in such a different way. And I know Paulette has spoken about that in terms of Signal to Help. That's where I learned about Signal to Help, was on TikTok, and just scrolling through and seeing young people share that signal. I love that we've all kind of talked about different ways, from talking about how intersectionality is such an important thing to talk about gender-based violence, talking about how we need to fund this in a real way and move forward, not only as foundations, but also as individuals and community members, and how we can do this in our homes, to our campuses. Now we have some questions from the audience, and I want to we're going to do two, and we have a very short period of time. So we're going to ask our really brilliant panelists to keep it a little bit shorter than before. One of the questions that we want to ask really is, knowing the fact of how do we ensure, this is for Jessica and Paulette, oftentimes when we talk about gender-based violence, it really does focus often on cis women. Why is it important to expand who's impacted by gender-based violence?
Happy to jump here first. I think on that conversation of intersectionality, the reason why we need to broaden that term, not to just talk about women who are cis, is because those who are genderqueer or non-binary experience violence in very different ways, including not having access to services, or they become criminalized as a result of their own GBV. I've heard many stories where unfortunately women become criminalized and then they're thrown into a system which only furthers their gender-based violence experience, or they don't feel safe in accessing services because, unfortunately, whether it be the service providers aren't cognizant of their experiences or their social vocations or their understandings, are not able to actually receive services. So when we talk about gender-based violence, we're talking about people who experience, we're talking about all genders. We're not talking about women's violence. And so it's important to do that, or else, like I said, we're going to continue to see people be, unfortunately, experiencing egregious violence as a result of our own biases, our own unwillingness or incapability to be able to expand what we mean when we talk about these things or educate ourselves, unfortunately.
So I think I love your answer, Jessica, and thank you for that. I feel like I'm seizing this moment to both learn and expand and become inspired. So I'm just loving the answers that Joanne gives as well, because she's one of the most learned persons when it comes to philanthropy in this country. And I love this question because I think it's a demonstration of how our sector continues to grow and learn and transform. That's what I love about this question. And so the use of the term gender-based violence is not an exclusive, but it's an inclusive term, right? So rather than violence against women, which is still important, right? So that's not gone away. It's about encompassing all violence on the basis of gender, right? And if you are committed to justice and equality, then you're committed to it for everybody, right? So this is what it means to me personally. And this is why the term of gender-based violence is an important, inclusive, broad-reaching term. It's important to recognize this so that approaches to prevention and support are inclusive and effective. And trans women, for example, face a higher risk, in fact, the highest risk, especially Black and racialized trans women, the highest risk. We had an example of that in our fair city just a few years ago, right? With this killer, right? So we know that that is true just from the statistics. And so we need to be able to know that they confront high barriers or the highest barriers in reaching out for support or shelter supports. In my early days, and I know if I have to be fast, I'll be fast. In my early days in this work, when I was at YWCA Toronto, so glad to hear the shout out for December 6th. I was there from the beginning for that. One of the things that we did with the late, great Cindy Cowan is actually have spaces for trans women, right? That makes me want to cry because I miss Cindy. But we worked on that together. And so this goes way back. It's not a new thing. But I love the transformation of the sector because we are open to learning and growing and making sure that we're becoming more inclusive. So this is how we want to be able to continue to make less people fall through. In fact, have no one fall through the cracks, as Jessica mentioned earlier.
Well, it already made me get emotional today, bringing up Cindy, because if people don't know, Cindy was an exceptional leader in the violence against women movement and probably just one of the people that you could go to and ask questions and she would expand your mind all the time. And I love that you're raising, both of you, the idea that we leave no one behind, that the work of gender-based violence is to ensure that no one is left to be harmed, that we make sure that the tent is big so that everyone can be there and get the support that they need. I want to ask one last question to the group. And, Joanne, maybe you can start us off. There's a lot of industry leaders that are here, people that are managers, leaders, or people that are worried about people in their workplace, people in their community. What are things that industry leaders, community members that are in a place of leadership can do to support folks that are experiencing gender-based violence?
I mean, I think really you need to be aware of the resources that are available, and I think everybody can do that. I'll just give an example of one. The Assaulted Women's Helpline offers 24 hours telephone in crisis line to all women who have experienced abuse. And if you can just have on your radar a couple of resources that you can refer, become educated. If you're looking to learn more about this issue, a book I'd recommend, A Good Wife, Escaping the Life I Never Chose by Samra Zafar. She moved to Canada from Pakistan in an arranged marriage at age 17 and suffered 12 years of physical and emotional abuse before she was able to leave. And she's doing a lot of speaking right now on the subject. And she called the Assaulted Women's Helpline, who helped refer her to resources to get out of the situation. And she is absolutely thriving.
I love that book. It's fantastic.
My favorite.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's also really important that we hear stories of racialized women, South Asian women around violence and the intricacies that they're facing. And she's becoming a doctor right now. I understand.
She's incredible what she's accomplishing.
Just a superstar. Paulette, from your place, where do you think that people in positions, that managers, industry leaders, community leaders, what can they do to support people around them that are affected by gender-based violence?
I said it before, and maybe I'll expand on it. So in addition to what Joanne has shared, a couple of things. I would say, especially if you're in, communities right across this country, especially if they're rural or suburban, learn about a couple services in your region, right? Learn about them, know what they are. And have them available so that if someone actually speaks to you, you are equipped with that information. So that's one thing I would share, which is both individual, but also for just knowledge. It's community knowledge, right? And then I would say it's important to be judgment free, right? Because the campaign we're doing is really about having the conversation be common conversation as opposed to hush-hush conversation. Common but critical, right? Because this is about community safety for folks in our community who are unsafe, who are at times at risk for their lives, right? So be judgment-free. And because someone doesn't leave a situation, it doesn't mean you're not helping. It means that they are building trust with you. And the way you react when they say something to you matters as to whether or not they'll approach you again. So just have that ear for listening, suspend your judgment, and just be a person and a place that they can come and feel safe to say something. Because if you know the statistics, it takes a woman many times before she can actually leave, right? So you don't know her situation. She may face different barriers in life. And so just being there for her and her knowing that you are a safe space and person for her to come to is really important.
I love that. And I think that's a great way to kind of move into the end of this conversation. I could talk to the three of you all day. I felt like I learned so much in these conversations. I did add in a warning signs list that Canadian Women's Foundation has on their website. So, if you're worried about someone or concerned, learning about those warning signs is also really important, as Paulette shared. I want to really thank Paulette, Jessica, and Joanne for being a part of this panel. Gender-based violence is such a hard conversation. It's a challenging conversation, and it's one that hits close to home for many of us. Many of us are from communities or families or are in our relationships where sexual violence, gender-based violence, workplace violence has occurred. And so making this time, I want to thank also the audience for being here, witnessing this conversation, participating. I want to also thank a huge thank to our lead sponsor, Generous Futures panel, which is TD Bank Group. Your leadership is truly commendable on this issue and on many issues that actually bring forth equity. Also, promotional partners, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Greater Toronto Chapter, the Canadian Association of Gift Partners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations of Canada. Again, our audience, we are going to be sending you an email in the next coming days with a recording of this conversation, as well as more support and resources for you to keep the conversation going in your community. I would hope that everybody's going to sign up and even boost up those numbers for Signal to help even more, because we know that great work that Canadian Women's Foundation has been doing. And please follow Jessica and Paulette on social media. They share brilliant things on LinkedIn and Twitter and all the things. Joanne, I tried to look you up, but I think you're more self. You're there. And we'll share those links in our email that we'll be sending out as well. So we cannot thank you enough. Also, knowing that we just had a conversation with gender-based violence could bring up stuff for you. So make sure to check in with the supports in your community, the Assault Women's Helpline. There's lots of supports, and make sure that to check in with the people that listen to it as well. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We're so happy to be here with you all.